Now, in the next 2 days, the country will be heading to the polls, yet concerns over safety, security and even the provision of basic services are still looming large. Ipsos, in conjunction with eNCA, has released new data which reflects the mood in the country. Now, political analyst Barry Hanyane joins me live from Potchefstroom in the northwest to take a deeper look into these findings. Professor, thank you very much for your time. I hope this third time is a charm.
Thank you, dear. A very good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to your viewers as well.
No, it's a pleasure to have you. Now, just looking at these figures, they're quite interesting. I mean, I see that in terms of governance in local areas, 60% of citizens are saying it's going in the wrong direction. But looking on the national front, we have a significant amount of people saying things are going in the right direction. Would you say this could be attributed to, or perhaps has informed the strategy of the ANC currently, where we saw a lot of those national figures, political figures, going to campaign on the ground in these local areas?
Well, dear, let me start by registering my sentiments towards that, to say I'm somewhat disappointed because the national leaders do not necessarily represent your local leadership, which I think an opportunity has been lost here to allow residents to be given a chance to engage with those who are going to be their representatives. And as things stand, unfortunately, is that your very same national leaders are likely to go into obscurity, so to speak, once the elections are done and dusted. And we will now be left with persons whom we haven't interacted with, we don't know much about them. And to make matters worse is that some of them have even defected to become independent candidates. So it's very strange that we're sitting with a finding that says, how do we juxtapose national interest and feeling versus your local interest, feeling, realities and experiences? And I would like to lean more towards local, seeing that this is a particular special space where service delivery must be observed, where governance, in actual fact, should be measured to determine the trajectory of our democracy.
But why do you think this is? Because it's been quite a talking point. Many people have spoken about this, raising concern that we even saw those of Thabo Mbeki's era. I mean, it was good to see him at their manifesto. It spoke of perhaps a returning to the old. But why do you think they decided to go this route as opposed to elevating the very local leaders that will engage with the citizens?
Look, I'm tempted to say somewhere in the corner of these political parties, and perhaps the core, lies the reality that the realities of local government are now known, thanks to your Auditor General's office, thanks to the number of corruption cases that have been reported by yourselves as media houses, but also investigations that have come to the fore. You have scandals like your VBS. You have, of course, particular or peculiar corruption cases. Suddenly now, we now know municipalities have been using your stick-here ideas as cash cows. A municipality will pretend to have built a stadium only to find that it's basically a mediocre structure that has been put there and money has been siphoned off. So it's all these issues that I suspect your major parties took to themselves, in particular the majority party, to say, how do we do damage control? How do we actually put ourselves, not necessarily allow councillors to come to the fore? And as I said earlier, I think this is a lost opportunity for us to really engage with the leaders that we're going to put in councils.
And then speaking of the EFF, now that you've mentioned them, I mean, they were out really pledging or discussing the main issues, which is your sanitation, your water, and even touched on employment there. But many are quite critical of that statement to say, beyond the voting, some of these municipalities actually were near collapse in terms of their finances. And we know this can be attributed to corruption, yes, and sometimes the rapid urbanization. Do you really think that some of these promises are just merely that, promises that they might not be able to fulfill, given that these municipalities are near collapse?
Well, this also demonstrates, on the other hand, that perhaps en masse there is a lack of political education out there. I'm wondering whether people have really looked at our constitution and interrogated it. If you look at Schedule 4 and 5, it makes it clear which competency areas fall under the jurisdiction of your broader local government sphere, which one falls in the under the jurisdiction of national government. So as a political party, you can't go out there and promise houses, for instance.
Yes.
That's a national competency area. So it's up to the electorate to basically understand these things, be aware of how our government operates, but at the same time, media, political parties themselves, perhaps by and large universities, must come to the party in terms of ensuring that there is civic education and a greater awareness of how government works, so that in turn, political parties should not and ought not to make false promises.
Now, on that point of greater awareness, just in closing, the proliferation of independent candidates, I mean, it's good and well for democracy, but in the current state, council is a numbers game. If there are no reforms, you know that that lone voice in there might find itself having to align with a bigger party if they want to see things done. Really, what they want to see in the communities might not actually be realized because they find themselves swaying to whichever bigger party is there and actually pushing that agenda. Do you think citizens ought to know as well that being an independent candidate means just that at this point, that you find yourself aligning with the bigger parties?
Well, let's not take away the cardinal role that residents have to play as well, and that is oversight. And of course, demanding accountability to those who have been put in council and represent them. So unfortunately, you're sitting in a society where issues of accountability, by and large, are far and few. Only in affluent urban areas you would find that independent candidates or political parties themselves are held to account by certain measures. In peri-urban and rural, the culture is somewhat flux, it's somewhat loose, and perhaps it reflects the appetite that those residents have towards issues of governance. But to be more direct on your question, let's learn from the Kenyan experience. If you don't regulate the role and perhaps the contribution of independent candidates in any system, this then opens up the back door for corruption, for colluding by and large, and perhaps sidelining residents who, by the way, are important in this instance to make sure that these independent candidates are elected and, of course, ought to be held accountable.
No, certainly worth a broader conversation, but thank you very much for your time. That's Professor Barry Hanyane talking to us on day one of the voting.